I'd like to introduce Jeffrey. He's one of the leading advocates for a GMO-free world. He's the author of Seeds of Deception and Genetic Roulette, and a long time promoter for GMO-free.
I think he did great. What do you think? Yeah. New career? New career, Ken? No, still good, no. I'm going to start out with a really gross picture, but you're lucky because it's not that big because it's only on an iPad. This is a rat with a tumor. That is not normal right there. That is tumor. That is a big tumor. And here's another tumor. And here's two tumors. These were released today. I was contacted some time ago that there was going to be a monumental study released this morning. But they weren't going to tell me the details. I had to wait till 6 o'clock this morning. And I quickly wrote an introductory sentence and sent out the link to an article that was covering it. But this is news. This news alone, if this were a rational world, maybe I should just stop there. If this were a world in which science was evaluated scientifically by scientists, this information would stop the genetic engineering of our food supply. These rats were fed Roundup-ready corn or Roundup or both for 24 months. And they died earlier than the control group. They had dramatic organ damage, and they had huge tumors, often mammary gland tumors. So, what's different about this study? Well, first of all, it was done by independent scientists, which is rare. Second, it was done for 24 months, which is almost unheard of. And the tumors began to show up, and the damage began to show up big time after 4 months. That's 120 days. The industry studies are 90 days. So they have conveniently eliminated the possibility of showing these type of disorders that show up after 90 days. And very few studies have been looking at intergenerational effects. One hamster study found by the third generation, most of the hamsters lost the ability to have babies. The infants died also at 4 or 5 times the rate, and many had hair growing in their mouths. So, this study alone, done in France, is sufficient to drive Roundup off the market or be highly regulated, and to drive GMOs off the market if this were a sane world. How many people think this is a sane world? Me either. While we're raising our hands, how many people are farmers? Let's hear from farmers. All right. Any gardeners here? All right. How many people eat? It's always amazing. On San Juan Island, there's more people that garden than eat. So, this affects us all, GMOs, whether we eat or grow or both. And this information is really interesting to me because I've been waiting for this type of stuff. And the biotech industry is already starting up fast-paced their spin machine. And this is a scientist who has had a history of having controversial findings. Controversial because they found problems with GMOs. Controversial because it was against Monsanto's Roundup and Roundup-ready crops. he was able to access the unpublished studies that Monsanto used to submit and get their products approved, where they said the rats passed with flying colors, and he examined the same raw data that Monsanto scientists did and found, no, these rats have signs of toxicity that you ignored. You see, the biotech industry has bad science down to a science. They know how to rewrite their studies. I talked to a former Monsanto scientist. He said, when they fed genetically modified corn to rats, the rats had serious problems, and so they redesigned and rewrote the study to hide the problems. This is what they do. We caught them red-handed. We know exactly the kind of unscientific things that they do. And if it's blatant fraud, like they just simply don't include a tumor, well, they can do that and we would never know. So when Monsanto wanted to say that Agent Orange was safe, they took 3 people who were exposed to dioxin and had serious health problems and put them into the unexposed group, according to an EPA investigator, and later the doctor who did it and testifying before the court, and then didn't show up the next day. He left the state because he was concerned about the backlash for the fraud. So they did this sleight of hand and then eliminated the compensation for all the Vietnam veterans. They hid the information about poisoning Anniston, Alabama residents with their PCB factory. Again, another Monsanto tragedy where one of their consultants put a live fish into a river, and within 60 seconds it shed its skin and spurted blood and floated to the top. But the response by the Monsanto executives was characterized in a single sentence in a letter that was confidential but made public because of a lawsuit. We can't afford to lose $1 of business. So this was the company that told us Agent Orange and PCBs and DDT were safe. And they're the ones cooking the books on their own studies. We know absolutely they use the wrong detection methods, the wrong statistics, the wrong controls. When they find death or serious disorders, they dismiss it by saying not treatment related without giving a justification, not dose related, or not biologically significant. When you talk to independent scientists about it, they like pull their hair out and say, this is not how science is done. They design a whole study where they compare one animal that's eating GMOs to another animal that's not eating GMOs, but is eating the same type of corn or soy, and they look for statistical differences, statistical significance. They find it, then they figure out how they can wipe it away. So then they look at, if they find statistical significance, they'll try and draw from a variety of different control groups, trying to take the significance away. So they have lots of different control groups with lots of different varieties. And still, if it's statistically significant, they'll say, oh, it's not treatment related because it's within the parameters of what animals normally react. So we're looking at all these other studies and looking for anything that shows these parameters. And so they say, see over there, from that study conducted 5 years ago in a different location with different food, it's within the biological parameters, so it's not a biological problem. This is not how science is done. You don't explain it away by pulling in data from other studies. And if it's still significant, then they say, well, you know, the males and the females reacted differently. Therefore, it's not treatment related. It's got to be something else. And it's like the guy who did this study was like, are you guys crazy? Have you been in science in the last 40 years? Oncology, hormones, we know that women and men, males and females, rats and whatnot, act differently, hormonal imbalances. And then one time there was a bigger reaction to the 11% feed than there was to the 33% feed. So, it's not treatment related. See? So we can ignore the entire outcome. All these little tiny ways in which they convince someone. Who are they convincing? Their own people who they put in the regulatory agencies. It says, this is what you're supposed to say. And then the European Food Safety Authority says what was in Monsanto's study. The regulators in India say what was in Monsanto's study. In Brazil, in the United States, in Canada, they just parrot what's in Monsanto's study, what their justification is. And when I interview scientists around the world, they go, this is not science. Some of the research is so blatantly false, like they wanted to show that injections of Monsanto's bovine growth hormone did not interfere with fertility, with cows. So they apparently added cows to the study. They were already pregnant before they got injections. And that wasn't made public until documents had to be stolen from the FDA and delivered anonymously to a doctor who read it. Oh, look, fraud. And when they wanted to show that bovine growth hormone was destroyed during pasteurization, they pasteurized the milk 120 times longer than normal. They only destroyed 19% of the hormone, but that wasn't good enough. They wanted to destroy more, so they rigged the research even further. They took powdered hormone, poured it into the milk, 147 times the natural occurring level of hormone, poured in, okay, got it. Heated it 120 times longer than normal, destroyed 90% of the hormone. They said, aha, pasteurization destroys 90% of the hormone. And the FDA said, 90% of the hormone is destroyed during pasteurization. Complete bogus science. When they wanted to convince Australian regulators that high lysine corn injected with something, some soil bacteria probably, to produce a protein, a lysine, for the pig, so you wouldn't add, all this was, the whole reason for this was, so you'd buy Monsanto's version of high lysine pig feed, rather than buying corn and lysine separately. And you'd pay extra for Monsanto. They'd stack it with all these things and say, this is pig feed corn. And they would have to charge extra for a royalty fee. So they tried to convince the Australian regulators that this extra protein, it has a history of safe use in the food supply, so it's completely safe. Why? Because it's in soil. And we eat soil, right? Residues on fruits and vegetables. So we have soil in our diet for sure, little pieces of soil, so the protein is safe. Well, Dr. Jack Heinemann decided to call their bluff and calculated what an average male American ate in terms of corn per day. And if that was Monsanto's high lysine variety, how much of that protein he would consume. And he calculated how much of that protein is found in soil. And then it was a simple calculation of how much soil an average male American would have to consume each day to have the same amount of protein. 22,000 pounds per second. They were off by several trillion. 22,000 pounds per second. Now, they have all these elaborate ways to lie about the science, but they also have elaborate ways to prevent others from doing the science. You see, they own the patents on the seeds. So in order to do the research, you have to get the grains. And if you can't go to a farmer because the farmer signs a contract saying the grain is not to be, the seeds are not to be used, or the crops are not to be used for research of any kind. Not scientific research, not even research of side-by-side yield research. So you can't get the seeds. 26 entomologists wrote a letter to the EPA saying there's no independent research on Bt crops, the crops designed to kill insects. Shouldn't we have independent research putting this Bt toxin into millions of acres in the United States? We can't do the research because they don't give us the seeds. And if they give us the seeds, we sign a contract that we have to turn over the data to them, and they get to determine what gets published. So there's no independent research. And if you do have some way of getting the seeds, and sometimes like these guys got the seeds, probably by getting friends to grow it and we won't ask, then you can't get the money. Because all of the academic institutions that do this kind of agricultural research are funded in part by the biotech industry, and that comes with strings attached. Sometimes they sign contracts that you can't do research on Monsanto's stuff if you're receiving Monsanto's money. Or, it's a little more diabolical, they contact the dean or the president and say, if this guy does the work, we're eliminating our support. And if the person does the work and gets the adverse findings, it's very difficult to publish, because there's a lockdown there too. So there was a report, a whole issue of a journal on the dangers of Roundup. Most of it was written by Americans, and it was published in the European Journal of Agronomy, because they wouldn't touch it in the United States. And if it's published, then you're really in trouble. Because then the forces come out to destroy your reputation. And they'll use every method. Threats, in Argentina, a gang attacking physically, vilification, personal attacks, etc., etc. Dr. Jack Heinemann, who's the one that did the calculation about the soil, he just reported last week that the genetically engineered wheat that they want to field trial in Australia has some double-stranded RNA in it that might shut down the DNA in humans that produce glycogen, which causes a liver disease, which in the case of children, if they have it, typically they don't live past age 5. And it was right there. He had the data, but instead of persons looking at it and taking it scientifically, they attacked him personally. And he responded a few days ago to the ad hominem attacks. So, what happens is, most of the research done on GMOs is tobacco science. Done by the industry, for the industry, not even published. When it becomes evaluated and becomes in public domain, it's usually torn apart as a disaster. Completely inappropriate. When Monsanto's big study that was proving that all genetically engineered crops were safe, and it was only focused on soybeans, the title was that basically genetically engineered soybeans are substantially equivalent to non-GM soybeans. And it started out saying the same thing. It concluded by saying the same thing. But if you actually read the data, there was all sorts of differences. The cream level was different in the milk produced from cows that ate one versus the other. There was a 27% increase in trypsin inhibitor, which is a known allergen in the soy. There was all these other reductions and changes, all hidden. But those things were cooked numbers anyway, because when you do a compositional analysis, you grow something side by side in the same climate and geography conditions, and you look for changes. But they didn't do that. They took things from all these different climate and geography so that there was all this background noise to wipe out any statistical significance. But in the one place where they actually grew something side by side in Puerto Rico, they mentioned that was part of the study, and left out all the data. The only place where they actually did it right, they hid the data. And a medical investigator found it years later in the journal archives and published it, and it turns out there was a known allergen in soy called trypsin inhibitor. It was 27% increase according to this study, but in reality, when it was done side by side in cooked GM soy, it was 7 times higher in one of the samples. 7 times higher, a known allergen. So you have the rigged research, then you have the independent studies, and as soon as the independent studies come out, they rush to publication, a study to counter it. So when some scientists did a research study on, actually here's even a funner story. They were about to publish Against the Grain, which is a book about GMOs, and they got a letter from Monsanto sent to the printer threatening. And the printer canceled the book, so they had to find someone else. But the letter said, and there's no difference in phytoestrogen levels. And the author said, we never said there was. Let's investigate. I don't know who's in charge of Monsanto's law firm, but they were really stupid. So they did an investigation and found there was 12 to 14% reduction in phytoestrogen levels, which are supposed to fight cancer and heart disease. And they published it, but Monsanto rushed its study to publication, saying there was so much variance in phytoestrogen levels, you couldn't do a statistical analysis. So the independent authors knew that the lab that they had used for their study was the same lab that Monsanto used for its study, because they were the experts at phytoestrogen extraction and evaluation. So they contacted the researcher and said, what gives? And the researcher said, they wouldn't let us use the state-of-the-art method. They forced us to use an obsolete method which was prone to high levels of variation. And that wasn't in the study, that was just, you had to know. So, unscrupulous companies, particularly Monsanto, voted the most hated company in the world for 10 years running, with strict, tough competition. They are in charge of determining if their foods are safe. Now, I am not making this up. They get a letter. There's a voluntary consultation process in the FDA. So, if you want to, you can say, FDA, I've got some data for you to look at. It's actually not data, it's basically some summaries and some conclusions, but here it is. And we decided we want it this way for this crop and this way. There's no standard. And if the FDA goes, oh, that's interesting, I have a question, and we said, we don't have to tell you. So we give a certain amount of data to the FDA, and at the end of this meaningless exercise, the FDA does not say, based on our analysis, we believe your foods are safe. It does not say GMOs are approved. What it says is, Monsanto believes its foods are safe. And this is to remind you that it is Monsanto's responsibility to make that determination. And that's it. That is our US government dollars at work protecting our health. And why is that the process? Why is that why we are exposed to products that are only required to have Monsanto's seal of approval? Because the person in charge of creating that policy was Monsanto's former attorney, later Monsanto's vice president. So he was working for Monsanto, then FDA, then Monsanto, now he's back at the FDA as the US Food Safety Czar. Michael Taylor. And the justification for this no testing, no labeling policy was that the agency is not aware of any information showing that GMOs are different. And that was a lie. Because Steve Drucker pioneered a lawsuit against the FDA, forcing 44,000 secret internal memos. And as he combed through the memos, as he says on our film, Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, I was shocked because I realized the FDA had been lying to the American public for nearly 2 decades. The overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the FDA was exactly the opposite of the statements made in the policy. They said GMOs could lead to allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, and everything should be tested carefully. Now we have this type of information. We're looking at rats like this, and they verify and vindicate the scientists at the FDA. But even before today, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine looked at the animal feeding studies that have been done, both industry studies and independent studies, and said, it's causal. It's a causal relationship between GMOs and disorders such as reproductive problems, immune system problems, gastrointestinal problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, dysfunctional regulation of cholesterol and insulin. They were so impressed with the research results that they said there should be immediate moratorium on GMOs in the United States. There should be labeling, and there should be an edict or a recommendation for every doctor in America, and they made this recommendation, to prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient and provide educational materials about the health risks and how to choose non-GMO products. Now, I was at a AAEM, American Academy of Environmental Medicine conference, a few months after they made that policy. And I was interviewing some of the doctors who were prescribing non-GMO diets. And they, unlike scientists who speak sort of like this, convergent lines of evidence indicate that such and such suggests that it might be and it appears to be such and such. That's how scientists speak. The doctors, however, were saying GMOs cause inflammation. GMOs, people who are allergic react to GMOs more than non-GMOs, and they'll tell you that. I tell my patients to avoid GMOs. When they do, everyone gets better. It never doesn't work. I mean, these statements were shocking to me, but these were their experience, because with doctors, they deal with the reality of patients' health. They deal with the reality of patients getting better or worse depending on the recommendations. So when I talked to Dr. Emily Linder, she not only knew that everyone gets better, she knew that if it was brain fog or some kind of depression, on a non-GMO diet it goes away immediately. If it's allergies or asthma, it takes 3 to 5 days. If it's a gastrointestinal disorder, it may take up to 4 weeks. Sometimes patients get better over 2 years. She had it down because she had been treating 5,000 patients with non-GMO diets, and everyone was getting better. So I went to her office and interviewed patients, and sure enough, one patient was on the diet for 25 days. After 3 days, her Crohn's disease disappeared. She had it for 30 years, until 3 days into the diet. Another one, irritable bowel, a week and a half. Another one, irritable bowel, 4 weeks. And another 12-year-old from another doctor, his asthma disappeared, and his migraine headaches disappeared. Another kid, he's probably 9 years old, serious, horrible pains in his gut. He was just crying uncontrollably. This went on for months. Changed his diet, disappeared. And it went on and on. I've been talking to people all over California in the last couple of months, and people send us unsolicited letters from restless leg syndrome to infertility to acne to ulcerated skin, all sorts of brain fog and fatigue. All these things were getting better when people switched their diets. Now, there is an interesting challenge to me as a science writer of sorts. I asked the people, how did you avoid GMOs? It's not labeled. And I heard something like, everyone said, well, I'm eating organic now. And sort of like I go, oh. And I'm getting rid of processed foods. And sometimes the people would say, my doctor told me to get rid of gluten and dairy. And I'm like, forget it. There's nothing I can do with that information. Because who knows what the cause is? Is the lack of pain in the gut due to a gluten intolerance that was just solved by non-gluten? Or was it the non-GMO diet? However, the farmers and veterinarians that we talk to, they take their livestock from GM soy to non-GM soy, from GM corn to non-GM corn. And they don't switch to organic. They don't take out the processed foods. You don't have gluten-free pigs, dairy-free cows. There's no cofactors. There's none of that background noise that's engineered into the Monsanto type of study. A Danish pig farmer was facing massive problems with diarrhea among his piglets until he switched to non-GM soy. He didn't tell his worker, but 2 days after switching, his worker came to him and said, "You switched the feed." And the guy said, "Really, what happened?" "Uh-oh." He said, "Diarrhea's gone." 2 days on non-GMO soy. Remember the woman, 3 days on non-GMO, Crohn's disease gone. In other words, irritable bowel, a week and a half, gone. 4 weeks, gone. Similar. Some people said ulcers cleared up, or acid reflux on a non-GMO diet. Well, the same pig farmer had lost, another one said bloating stomach cleared up. Said they had lost 36 pigs in the previous 2 years from ulcers and bloat, but not in the years since switching to non-GM soy. Roundup is linked to birth defects. He had 13 birth defects the previous year, none in the year since. Conception rate went up, litter size went up, use of antibiotics went down, the immune system was stronger. I talked to a farmer in Iowa. He switched to non-GM corn. Immediately, medicine rates went down. The behavior of the pigs was changed back to what had been 14 years ago before they switched to GM corn. He was shocked. He had no idea that the huge increase in diseases and change in behavior was due to the GM corn he had been feeding his pigs all this time. A feedlot operator, until he switched to non-GM corn, he didn't realize the more he was feeding his pig, his cows, corn that was genetically modified, the more they'd die. And then he realized he would get the pneumonia and infectious diseases. These are in the film Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives. A famous veterinarian, Michael Fox, who runs the syndicated column Animal Doctor, 25 to 30 million readers. When GMOs were introduced, he pointed out to me in an interview years ago, the cats and dogs eat the byproducts of the human industrial food model. So if there's a change in there, they'll feel it. And sure enough, when GMOs were introduced, he started getting letters from pet owners, diarrhea, inflammatory bowel disease, itching, allergies. What do? He said, get him off of the GMO soy and corn. 40 to 60 letters came into his file cabinets. They got better. Now, if you put it all together, you see there's certain categories of problems that the American Academy of Environmental Medicine said are found in the animal feeding studies. Principally, reproductive, immune, gastrointestinal, organ damage. If you look at the animals that are taken off of GMOs, they get better in these same categories. You look at the humans that take themselves off of GMOs, they get better in these same categories. You look at the rise of diseases in the United States since GMOs were introduced, and what do you see? These same categories. So a lot of the increase that we're seeing in humans, including autism, we're seeing those same symptoms in animals that are fed GMOs. And if you look at why GMOs might be creating that, I'll just give you 3 fairly scary reasons. Roundup, which may be responsible for this, causes or is linked to cancer. That's cancer. It's linked to Parkinson's. It's linked to endocrine disruption. So it causes reproductive problems and birth defects. Now, the animals, the rodents that were fed Roundup-ready crops, like soy or corn, before this study, changes in the young sperm cells, testicles change from pink to blue, changes in the uterus and ovaries, the DNA functioned differently in the embryo offspring. More than half the babies died within 3 weeks. The babies were smaller, the babies couldn't reproduce, there were also lower litter size. By the 3rd generation in hamsters, most lost the ability to have babies, some had hair growing in their mouths. So these are astounding research results, which may be linked to the Roundup, which is drank by the crop, stored in the food portion, in part, which we then eat. Roundup also chelates or binds with minerals, making them unavailable for digestion, so it could rob the plant, the animal eats the plant, and the human eats the animal and the plant and the Roundup, causing nutrient deficiency, which can cause all sorts of diseases. And Roundup is now linked to a promotion of a new pathogen in the soil and in the feed, and now in animals that are having high levels of miscarriage. So this new pathogen appears to cause sterility and miscarriages, and it's in high levels of feed treated with Roundup. It might affect human beings. So that's Roundup, which might affect, for example, the reproductive disorders that we talked about. It might influence gastrointestinal also because it's an antibiotic and it kills the gut bacteria. So gut bacteria is part of our immune system. A significant part of our immune system is in the gut. Roundup kills gut bacteria and can cause all sorts of other problems like that. So some of the immune system problems and gastrointestinal problems can also be linked to Roundup, as well as the cancer. So the other category is the Bt toxin, which is a soil bacterium that you take a gene that produces a Bt toxin, take it out of the soil, put it into the corn or the cotton, and now the plants are registered as pesticides, and they break open the stomach of insects and kill them if the insect happened to bite any aspect of the plant. Now the EPA said, don't worry, because the Bt toxin is destroyed during the human digestive system process, and it has no impact on human cells. Well, that's not true. They took Monsanto's corn and took out the Bt toxin, exposed it to human cells, and it poked holes in those cells too, causing leakage. And they looked in the blood of pregnant women in Canada, and 93% had Bt toxin in the blood, and it was in 80% of their unborn fetuses. So it does influence human cells, it does survive digestion, it may create leaky gut by poking holes in the cell walls. If leaky gut is created by Bt toxin, then we may end up with food allergies, autoimmune disease, inflammation, Parkinson's, cancer, Alzheimer's, and autism, all related to leaky gut. Now, the scientists in Canada said that the Bt should be washed out fairly regularly, and so what is the cause of why 93%, such a high percentage of these women had the Bt toxin in it? They're not like in Mexico where they eat corn tortillas every day. They figured it was eating the milk and meat of animals that do eat Bt corn every day. So they blamed it on the animals, so they were saying not only does Bt toxin survive digestion in us, it survives digestion in the animals, and the same toxin survives digestion in humans and ends up in our blood. But I think a more plausible explanation goes back to a 2004 study which showed that genes can transfer from soybeans into gut bacteria and may continue to function. So if the Bt toxin gene which is eaten in corn tortillas and polenta and all that stuff, and sweet corn now, if that gene that produces the Bt toxin transfers to the gut bacteria and continues to function, it converts it into living pesticide factories, so that would provide a sufficient source of continuous contamination or production of Bt toxin within our very digestive tract. And this might explain the increase of inflammatory bowel disease, up 42% since GMOs were introduced, and Crohn's disease, and irritable bowel, and all these other things, gastrointestinal inflammation, leaky gut, etc. So that's just the Roundup and the Bt. Then you have the background noise, the collateral damage that occurs as a result of the process of genetic engineering, which can increase existing allergens, add new allergens, as in the case of Monsanto's corn, cause problems with anti-nutrients, that's happened with the soy, etc., etc. So there's the background noise, which itself is dangerous, so it means no matter what gene you put in, you might create cancer or heart disease or something as a result of the side effects due to the process of genetic engineering. So this is why we think GMOs are in fact responsible for the increase of all these diseases in the United States, and why people seem to get better when they stop eating GMOs. And no one is actually evaluating this relationship. There's no group in the world that's now collecting information about people changing their health status when they switch to non-GMO diets, except our little Institute for Responsible Technology. So it's a crazy thing out there where I just painted a picture of a dramatically dangerous new technology, and it gets a little worse, in that when we put this into the environment, it can cross-pollinate, and the self-propagating genetic pollution can outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste. So now, I want to ask you, how many of you have decided to be more vigilant in avoiding genetically modified foods since I started? Raise your hand. Okay. Anyone less vigilant? Got a death wish? Okay, so I'm just looking at this guy right here all the time. I just like our mascot. Need to protect all the guinea pigs, all the rats. So here's an interesting concept. When I used to do this in nearly every lecture. I'd ask the audience to rate themselves from 1 to 100 how vigilant they've been in avoiding GMOs. And then I'd say how many people are low vigilance, that should be most of you, 1 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60. And people would rate themselves before, and then I'd say, rate yourself how active you've been at getting the word out about GMOs, and then we do the same thing. And then after 45 minutes, showing pictures of the testicles that change from pink to blue, showing changes in the liver cells, describing the thousands of 6-year-old and dead livestock, etc., I say, rate yourself how vigilant you'll be next week in avoiding GMOs. How many people are low vigilance, 1 to 20? Raise your hand. No one raised their hand. It was the majority before, like 30 minutes ago, 40 minutes ago, but no one was willing to eat a GMO just cavalierly. So hardly anyone was 20 to 40, maybe no one, 40 to 60, maybe no one, 60 to 80, we started seeing some hands coming up. Most people were between 60 and 100 at the end of the night. And then I asked rate yourself how active you want to be in getting the word out. Same thing, big shift. So what is interesting is this, that this alone, what we have just done in not too long, what we have just done is provide a demonstration of how to eliminate GMOs from the food supply. Because all it takes is a small number of the US population to say no to GMOs, and since there's no consumer benefits to GMOs, they can become a pure marketing liability, and a tipping point of consumer rejection will drive it out of the market. And the same companies that already removed GMOs in Europe because of a consumer tipping point there in 1999 will remove it here. They will see. They knew it happened quickly and with great surprise in Europe, because in January of that year, the biotech industry was projecting that within 5 years, there'd be a 95% replacement of all commercial seeds in the world with genetically engineered seeds by 2004. 3 days later, a gag order was lifted on a scientist who had been doing research for the UK government, found out that GMOs were seriously damaging to the guts and brains and testicles and liver and immune system of rats. He was fired and silenced and gagged. And his gag order was lifted, and that set off the firestorm of media, and 10 weeks later, virtually every major food company committed to stop using GM ingredients because it was covered in the press, because now consumers were concerned. And it took the food companies by surprise, it took the biotech industry by surprise, so they're aware that there can be a flash fire of anti-GMO sentiment rushing through public opinion. And not just in Europe, they're aware that Walmart, Starbucks, Yoplait, Dannon, most American dairies kicked out bovine growth hormone when the link to cancer was made public by our organization and others. So they see that a tipping point can change American diets and the marketplace here. So if they see any drop in market share associated with non-GMO sentiment growing here, that's like an industry sell signal. Get rid of GMOs. We think 5% of US shoppers avoiding GM ingredients would be sufficient. And if GMOs are labeled, we think it'll be quicker because they know that most Americans say they would avoid GMOs if labeled. So California has a labeling bill on the ballot, and 19 states have entertained labeling bills this year. None have gotten past Monsanto's threats and lobbying, but we think it's just a matter of time, and hopefully November 6th, where the labeling will become law. Now, if that's the case, we will see a tipping point of consumer rejection on steroids, and the food companies will get rid of it. And that will be a good thing for or places that have GM-free zones that can grow non-GM seeds and non-GM produce, etc., that's reliable and believed by the industry. So that brings a kind of a segue into the San Juan Island initiative, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, there are early signs of a tipping point already. The fact that all these bills have come up before local state legislators, the fact that there's a ballot initiative in California, that's a demonstration of more liveliness and collective consciousness about concern of GMOs. And we also see that non-GMO products are one of the fastest growing label claims in America. For the last 3 years, that's another sign of a tipping point. And if you want to know how to avoid GMOs, there's 9 genetically modified food crops: soy, corn, cottonseed oil, canola oil, sugar from sugar beets, papaya from Hawaii or China, little zucchini, little crookneck squash, and alfalfa used for hay. Our shopping guide, which is available on the table, describes those. The more detailed shopping guide is online. either as an application for an iPhone called Shop No GMO, or a website called non-gmoshoppingguide.com. And those are both listed on the shopping guide. You can each get one for free. So that's, in a nutshell, what I normally speak about with a longer talk, with more embellishment, a few more jokes, a couple more stories, and the purpose is to drive a tipping point. And we have the right brain book, Seeds of Deception, the left brain book, Genetic Roulette, and the videos for the visual learner, and we have the podcasts for the social media person, and we have the blogs, and we have all this stuff. We take the same information that changes people's diets in a lecture and package it for mass distribution. And then we rely on people who get the inspiration to change the world and protect themselves and their loved ones to get the word out. Because we can't do it ourselves, and I'm not going to speak to 15 million Americans if I do this every day. It's got to be multiplied. So that's the basic piece. But in the San Juan Islands, I'll now start my lecture. That was just a prelude. In the San Juan Islands, it's a different thing. Because here, there's a focus on creating a GM-free zone. Now, if Iowa, where I'm from, if some farmers got together and looked at market forces and created, in the year 1999, a GM-free zone for just one particular GMO, Starlink corn, could have been worth millions of dollars to that county or the state. Because Starlink was approved for animal consumption, but not human consumption. Which is a really stupid thing. Because, you know, the EPA that did that approval must not have any concept of agriculture, birds and bees, human nature, or corn. But they approved a partial approval, and sure enough, a GMO detection laboratory, where I happened to be vice president of marketing at the time, discovered Starlink corn in Taco Bell taco shells from Kraft for the Friends of the Earth who had sent it in to test it. And it resulted in a $1 billion problem. Lawsuits, halted U.S. exports of corn to Europe and Japan, price dropped dramatically for corn, huge efforts to clean up. I mean, it was a disaster from agribusiness point of view, absolute disaster. And of course, the Starlink is at least in some corn today, because it's part of the gene pool, but it's dramatically less. It started out at less than 1% of the acres grown, but it's now a tiny level of contamination. But it caused a huge $1 billion problem. 315 products were subject to recall from the supermarket shelves. When rice was planted in a field trial, a genetically engineered variety that was never approved, in 2001, somehow by some act of God, or insect, or wind, or water, or human error, it contaminated the rice supply in the United States, and we never knew until 5 years later. And when it was announced, rice futures dropped by $150 million within 2 days. And that was a $1 billion problem. The latest settlement was $750 million from Bayer Crop Science. And the non-GMO farmers, everyone suffered on that one because it was an unapproved variety. Again, we lost shipments to Europe and to Japan. And sometimes, we're listening to Jeffrey take off his jacket. Sometimes the non-GMO farmers bear the brunt of the contamination episodes. So the organic chip producer ended up destroying 87,000 bags of chips because they turned out to have GMOs in them in Europe, and all sorts of horror stories of different people that had to cancel their shipments, destroy their shipments, lose their organic premium, lose their non-GMO premium because of contamination. Now, if the tipping point of consumer rejection happens, there's going to be a need for non-GMO seed. And there's always a need for non-GMO seed. In fact, it sells at a premium in some cases. And brassicas are at risk from canola, because canola is genetically engineered and it can cross-pollinate or cross-contaminate brassicas like cauliflower and broccoli. And the seeds, some of the seeds for that are grown in Willamette Valley in Oregon, and they want to plant canola there. And a judge just stopped it, pending review, but if he doesn't keep that injunction, then that whole seed growing area is at risk, and they may not be able to do any more brassica seed production. And that's a very, very high value added product, which might be perfect for the climate here, for exporting seeds. Someone told me it's like 15 grand an acre of profit that's available. I don't know if that's true, but I learned that yesterday. So there are economic opportunities being a non-GMO island, a non-GMO county, and that those opportunities might increase dramatically under a number of circumstances. One, a tipping point of consumer rejection. They're going to need to get a lot of seeds. Two, a discovery that Roundup is causing these type of problems, and Roundup does not just wash out of the soil. It can last for years and years, decades even. You know, let's say they find that the Roundup is causing this pathogen that causes miscarriages or infertility. There's going to be a high premium for products grown on soil that was not drenched with Roundup because of Roundup-ready crops. You know, there's so many ways that non-GMO regions can benefit. The futures, whether it's a tipping point or not, even if there's no tipping point, if there just remains a completely dedicated group of non-GMO eaters, they're going to end up paying a premium for the non-GMO crops. And having an island buffer will convince people that it's really non-GMO, where oftentimes foreign markets aren't so convinced. When Canada was going to introduce genetically modified wheat, the Canadian Wheat Board found out that if any GM wheat was introduced anywhere in the country, they'd lose 87% of their export markets. When 25% of U.S. Corn was genetically engineered, America lost 99.6% of its corn exports to Europe, because they didn't believe that someone could contain the 75% and keep it pure. But there's an advantage if you have a zone that's non-GMO, and that there's practical steps to maintain that non-GMO status. So it is an economically important step, especially at this time. It's a good health step. It's a good environmental step. I mean, if you end up with Roundup-ready crops, they're drenched with Roundup. Roundup remains in the soil. For subsequent plantings, year after year, the vitality of the soil is tapped. You have more pathogens in the soil, like Fusarium. You have more head scab for wheat. You have et cetera, et cetera. There's more than 40 different plant diseases on the rise because of the overuse of Roundup. Roundup can then drill down into the water table and then can affect the drinking water. And the rats in this study had these results drinking Roundup in the water at a, quote, safe level. So the level where the EPA said is safe for us to drink Roundup is causing massive tumors in rats. And sometimes the Roundup gets in the water table at higher levels than that, like in Denmark, where they had to ban it because Roundup can do that. Then Roundup can mess up the soil bacteria completely, killing the beneficial ones, promoting the pathogens. BT can bind with clay in the soil and remain active for years. It can be washed into rivers and damage the marine ecosystem by killing caddisflies, etc. So the ecosystem itself is very fragile, and you get pummeled with high volume of Roundup and BT. And then, of course, the genes from the crops can transfer into the macroorganisms in the soil and maybe the microorganisms, and now you have a reservoir of genes that might, who knows, maybe they'll reinfect other crops. We don't know. The studies haven't been done. And the insects that eat the BT can die, but also the non-target insects that aren't supposed to die can be killed or hurt. And the insects that eat, the positive insects that eat the target insects can end up eating the BT, and they can have suffering in their populations. And the biodiversity also suffers. If you go to Argentina, where there's massive miles of GMO soy, there's no other plants, there's no insects, there's no birds. There's nothing other than this like factory field of soy that's been drenched with Roundup from airplanes that also drift onto the homes of peasants that have killed their livestock, their plants, and in some cases their children. So we have a situation where the environment is suffering, and then you also have the Roundup, which can cause birth defects at high rates when it's used in these farms. So in Argentina, there's certain birth defects that are as much as 70 times higher in certain regions than other regions where they don't use Roundup. And you have also the possibility of breathing in the pollen, where it happened in the Philippines, a whole village of about 100 people were breathing in Bt pollen from an adjacent cornfield and suffered skin, intestinal, and respiratory problems and fever. And the same seeds were planted in 4 more villages, and the same problems returned during those times of pollination. In Hawaii, where there's a ton of GM experimental crops, a whole school had to be abandoned during the day when the kids started falling sick. They had to go to the hospital. They were downwind from one of the genetically engineered fields. We don't know if it was the pesticides or the pollen. We just don't know. And of course, there's distortion and denial on the part of the corporations. So there's a lot of reasons why a GM-free zone would be better for you for health and environment. So it's better for economy and agriculture. It's better for health and the environment. And what are they trying to say to convince you not to? If you look at their opposition statement, first of all it says it's unnecessary because there are no GMOs planted in San Juan County. And then later they try and convince you that GMOs are really good. Now think about this logic. It doesn't make sense. They're saying it's unnecessary because there are no GMOs. Therefore, if it's unnecessary, why are you even arguing it? In fact, it's necessary because there are no GMOs. We want to maintain non-GMO status. So this concept that it's unnecessary because there's no GMOs doesn't mean anything. It means that no one has to uproot anything right now. It's a good thing. It's not one of their points, it's one of our points. They borrowed it from us and tried to pretend that it was theirs. Then they said, it's unenforceable because you can't test for GMOs on the island. Well, I found out actually you can. And you can do strip tests, like a pregnancy test, on site with a blender. Are there any blenders in the county? No. No blenders. Okay, you can't do it, sorry. But I used to work in a GMO detection laboratory. We used to receive samples from all over the country, all over the world. What is it, Pony Express here? You can't enforce it because we don't have a laboratory here that can find it. What century are you talking about? You gotta send it by canoe. We'll never get back in time. It's completely garbage. But the most garbage is the third one, which says it's unwise. Why? Because GMOs will increase yield. Actually, they decrease yield. Look at failure to yield, Union of Concerned Scientists. They'll feed the world. Actually, they work against feeding the world. Look at the ISTAD report from the UN, over 400 scientists, 58 countries signing on. GMOs have nothing to offer feeding a hungry world. They'll reduce agricultural chemicals. Wrong, they increase agricultural chemicals by over 500 million pounds in herbicide. And with insecticide, the Bt toxin, yes, you may spray less insecticide on a Bt cornfield, but the amount that you don't spray is dwarfed by the amount of Bt toxin that ends up in the soil and in the environment. It's at least twice the amount, in some cases 10 or 12 times the amount of that you'd be spraying. So all of these made up things, and then they talk about salt tolerance and drought tolerance and more nutrition. They've been saying that for 20 years. They don't have anything that matches that. They have a terrible drought tolerance thing, which is called drought tolerance. It doesn't work any better than conventionally grown things, and it works worse than the better ones that are grown from conventional methods. No salt tolerance, no added nutrition. These are beyond their capability because they don't understand how DNA functions. So all of this concept of why it's unwise, those are based on myths and lies. So what's their argument? The argument is, we may not be able to sell GM seed there. You may be setting a precedent for other places. We might lose money. My response, yes, you might. And that would not be a bad thing. Because right now, Monsanto is the largest seed dealer in the world. And when they end up with such a monopoly, what can they do? Increase the cost of seed, sometimes doubling it or tripling it, eliminating the availability of non-GM seeds in the most popular categories. Selling it to places like India, where they convince millions of farmers through deceptive advertising that BT cotton is going to make them rich, so the farmers, in a desperate attempt, will borrow money from loan sharks and invest in the more expensive seeds and associated chemicals, and many times aren't able to even pay back their loans, and 200,000 have committed suicide. And the animals grazing on the BT cotton plants, thousands are dying, and the farm workers touching the cotton plants are getting rashes and itching all over their bodies. So this is the company that we don't necessarily want to enhance their profit and capacity to do harm. So they have no logical argument. They are bereft of a moral basis. They are bereft of a scientific basis. It is an economic argument that they're trying to dress up as some kind of emotional argument that will convince people. Oh, you're going to hurt farmers, you're going to hurt the economy, you're going to hurt yourselves. No, you're going to hurt Monsanto's fortunes, which is not a bad thing. So what's going to happen is, probably, maybe, they're going to mount a disinformation campaign. And disinformation campaigns do not work well when people are pre-informed, when people have been antidoted, when people have been told by their neighbors, by their friends, by the more informed, by the people that went to the lecture, what the story is. So it is very, very simple, with the numbers of people on this island and in this county, to antidote, to preempt the myths that will be thrown at them, and it just takes some few contacts. So the groups that have the listservs of people that do all sorts of things, whether it's Friends of this, whether it's, the PTA, whether it's the Oddfellow Society, they have the listservs, get a connection between them and the organizers like Ken and Marty, and get the truth out, so that everyone sees it at least 5 times in their inbox, so they'll eventually read it and go, oh yeah, everyone seems to be in favor of 2012-4. Let's do that. And sometimes it's individual voter contact, starting with the people you love and you know, who trust you. I went to a lecture, this is what happened, you don't believe me? Watch the film, read the book, here's the website, etc. Take a look at the rest. It's not hard to convince someone who's not really that interested, who doesn't know. If you're compassionate and you know them, tell them. And if you don't know them, there's ways to tell them they're very effective. And they're being designed right now so you can pick up the phone and call people. And you can get a list and you can talk to them and say, yeah, I think I'll spend a couple of evenings, maybe even several evenings, protecting all living beings and all future generations in San Juan. Maybe it'll be worthwhile. I think it'd be more than worthwhile, because what you're doing is, you see, the biotech industry wants to replace 100% of all commercial seeds. They want to replace nature. They want to take the entire evolution of the planet, of all the different species that have resulted in this level of biodiversity, and mix and match with designer genes designed for greater profit. So they want to eliminate the natural selection and have everything Monsanto selection. And we know what kind of things can happen. And we know that it's up to us. The plants don't have the ability to say no, but we do. And so this is an opportunity that's vast in its impact. It's vast in its ability to say, this section of the earth remains the earth's. This section of nature remains in nature's hands. This wildlife gets to enjoy wildlife and not Monsanto life. This is our land. not this land is our, this is not Monsanto's land, this is not the FDA, the enforcement wing for Monsanto's land, this is ours, and we are the stewards of the land, and we're protecting it. And we see the kind of miserable science and miserable ethics and dangerous influence that these companies have on Earth, and we are drawing the line. In fact, the line is already drawn because we're islands. We're just enforcing it, saying, no, don't put it on the ferry, don't land it by plane. It's not yours to do. So this is an opportunity here that's also being echoed around the world. There's GM-free zones in Mendocino County, in Santa Cruz County, in Trinity County, in Marin County in California, in a city in Maine, in Switzerland, in Norway, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in states of Washington, in states in Australia, and New Zealand, in Peru, in Venezuela, I think I said that. All over the world, there's GM-free zones by people standing up and saying no. So others have done it before, others will do it after, and you are the only one in this country right now who on November 6th will have the pleasure and privilege of voting in this way for your nature. And so show the world, show the entire world, because they all look at America and say, what's up with Americans? They just fall sheep to these GMOs. You say, not here, not in the San Juans. We are not going to do that. So this is an opportunity. It's really worth rallying for. It's really worth getting in touch with the organizers, getting organized tonight, so I'll leave a little time for that, to organize and to get moving and to figure out how you can feed into this victory. Because it's not hard. And on the other thing, it's fun. It's fun working for something so huge. I can tell you from my experience, when you work for all people who eat, all living beings, all future generations, it feels like, you get support from that too. Somehow the karma of of that fate is tied up in our success, and somehow it feels like you're part of the bigger team, a much bigger team, and a team that's not just today, but really is epic. So I'm very, very happy and honored to be speaking to you tonight, because you are the pioneers right now in the United States, you and the Californians, in two very different but related ways. Labeling over there, and not on our islands over here. So I'm thrilled to be here, especially on this auspicious day where we have these rats speaking to us saying, please help us. Please help us. We don't want our children to look like this. We don't want your children to look like this. We have been sacrificed so you can see us. And now that you can see us, what are you going to do about it? And I think what the San Juan Island people have is something glorious to do about it. Thank you very much.